So I'm going to go ahead and log in, and it brings you to the calendar page. I currently have mine set to month view. If you prefer to look at it in a week view or a day view, all you have to do is click over to that tab and check off Make Default View, and next time you log in, that's the screen it'll bring you to. The very first time you log in, you need to come to this Setup tab, and your username will be listed over here on the left. Go ahead and click that pencil symbol next to your name, and then this is where you have to assign yourself sports. So the first time you log in, none of these will be checked off, and you need to assign yourself the sports, whatever you're reporting for, check off those sports, hit save, and log out and log back in so that the system can register that you've added those sports. If you guys have, for example, an assistant athletic trainer that you'd also like to have an account to help enter data, on this Setup tab, you would just hit New, and this is where you would fill out all their information, assign them sports, and then hit Save, and then they should receive a system-generated email with their login credentials. The next thing I'm going to show you is adding athletes. So we recommend adding your rosters at the beginning of the season just so throughout the season it's much easier to come in and just add an injury for someone as opposed to having to create their profile and then also enter the injury. So when you click on the Athlete tab, this Create New Player is already open for you. Kind of a theme you'll see throughout the system is that anything with a yellow asterisk next to it is a required field to save. And then these fields that are blue text, that means they're required for a quote-unquote Datalys complete record. So on this page, all of the ones that are blue also have that yellow asterisk, but you'll see other spots throughout the system where it's just blue, no asterisk, and that means you can come back later, fill it in after you've initially saved it. So all of this identifying information does not come through to us, only you guys see that. Same for this contact info and insurance info tab. Some athletic trainers use this as their primary record keeping, so they like to enter that information. It's not required, and if you do enter it, none of it comes through to us. This is where you'll add the person's sport, and if you forget to do that Setup tab that first time you log in, you'll go to select a sport, and this drop-down will be blanked. So if you make it to this point and you're seeing no sports on this list, double check that you've completed that Setup tab, logged out, and logged back in. You can select a position for them, and then after you select those, make sure you hit this green plus sign. You have to do that because athletes can play more than one sport, but even if they're only participating in one, you do need to go ahead and hit that green plus sign. So then the only other required field on this page is their current class, and once you hit save, those athletes will start populating over here on the left. The next thing I'll show you is the calendar tab. Like I said, you can make your view whatever you'd like. I'm just going to come back to that month view. We do track all of your practices and games, and we have you enter those because we like to know when athletes aren't getting hurt just as much as when they are. So you do have to record your schedule, and what I'm going to do is I'll show you how to add one exposure at a time, and then I'll show you how you can add several weeks worth of exposures at once. So to add one single day, you'll come to that day on the calendar and click that green plus sign. You'll notice on this page that first field where there's no asterisks, which means you can come back later and enter number of participants. The rest of these are just a series of drop downs. So the start and end time, the system defaults it from 6 to 8 a.m. You can certainly leave it there. We don't need exact times for those. If you prefer to change them so that your calendar accurately shows when your teams will actually be practicing, you can go ahead and change those if you want. So number of participants isn't required to save because you can add future exposures, and of course you don't know how many people are going to be there in the future. We also know how busy you guys are, so we don't expect you to get an exact head count every single day. So the days that you don't know how many people are participating, we just ask that you enter the roster size. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that. And if I come back to the calendar, you'll see that that is now on that day. Once the practice or game or whatever event type it is occurs, if you want to go back in to enter that participation count, you would just hover over it. You can either hit Edit Activity, and it'll bring you right back to that page I was just on, or you can just hit Participants. This little pop-up comes up, and you can enter it and hit Save. And you'll notice now that in the upper right-hand corner, it says 0 out of 21, so there's currently 0 injuries out of the 21 participants that were there. The next thing I'll show you is the way to add several weeks of exposures at a time, and that's this wizard tool right here. So you'll select a sport, the academic year, and then you're required to enter a preseason and a regular season to use the wizard tool. You can add a postseason, but of course that's not always applicable for every team, so it's not required to use the wizard to set up a season. So preseason would be the first day of practice or tryouts, the very first time your team is meeting. And then the last day of preseason would be the last day before your first competition. So that includes scrimmages. So if it's not your first official game, it's still considered preseason. So once you define that, you'll hit Add, and then you'll switch this to regular season, and regular season would start the day of your first competition, and it goes until the last competition that's on your schedule. So you'll hit Add, and then if everything looks okay, you'll hit Next. This is where everything has to be one activity type when using the wizard. So since there's always way more practices and competitions in any given season, we recommend that you set everything to a practice. And then I'll show you when we get back to the calendar how you can go through and edit the handful that should be switched to competition. Also, some practice on multiple different surfaces throughout the season. So if you're setting up your season using the wizard, we just say to enter whatever you're most often on. Starts on would be that first day of preseason. Again, start time, duration, you can edit that if you want, but leaving it as the system defaults it is totally fine as well. And this is where you'll pick the days where you want everything to repeat. So a lot of schools, for example, have things Monday through Saturday and never on Sundays. So you can check off every day that you want it to repeat for, and then enter the number of weeks that you want it to repeat for, and hit Add, and then you'd hit Next. This is just a review of what you've set up, and then you'll hit Confirm and Save. And if I click back to Calendar, you'll now see that for every Monday through Saturday, a softball exposure has been added to the calendar. So that's a little bit easier to get everything on the calendar ahead of time, and then just edit the few that should be competitions. So if you have your schedule in front of you and you hover over it, just hit Edit Activity, and then change that activity type to competition, and hit Save. and that way you can just go through and edit the ones that should be competitions. If you prefer to come in each day and just add one exposure at a time, that's totally fine as well. We just like to show you both options. The way to add injuries is you come to the calendar, and whatever the date of injury is, you'll hover over that day and hit Add Injury, and then the date is already set and it's connected to that exposure for you, and you'll just start entering the athlete's name. And it has that type ahead where you can select the athlete, and so if there's multiple people with the same couple first letters of the name, you'll just select whichever one you want. And then you'll see this injury event. All of these are a series of drop-downs. If it's, for example, an away game and the athlete is coming back to report it and they don't know some of these answers, you just ask that you set it to unknown instead of leaving it blank, and that way it's considered complete. The outcome is how long the athlete is out of. Again, you can save without selecting this, but you just have to come back in and select one. And whatever you initially save it's not permanent. So if you think the athlete's going to be out 1 to 6 days and they end up being out for 10 days, you can edit it when you come back in. I'm going to leave return date blank for right now. And then next is this injury and illness information. So to pick the diagnosis, you'll click this magnifying glass. Here you can type in the word knee, for example, and everything related to the knee will populate. A way to narrow it down a little bit more is this second box is choose the body part and then the type of injury. And then you'll see the list is much more narrowed down for you. You'll click the green check mark next to the injury and then fill out the rest of the drop-downs. Severity is just whatever your clinical judgment is, whether or not it's recurrent, whether or not it's chronic, and whether or not surgery is required. And that's actually whether or not surgery is required within 6 months. So if you have an athlete that comes back a month later and you had answered no to surgery, but they let you know they are getting surgery in relation to this injury, and edit that, switch it to yes. Like sport at the beginning, you'll click this green plus sign because technically multiple injuries could occur in the same exposure. So that's how you would just start adding a second injury if that's applicable. This notes section you can use as a SOAP note area, any descriptions of the injury that may have been missed in the drop-downs, but none of that comes through to us, so you can enter whatever you'd like there. And then you'll just hit save. You'll notice right now that this right here says 14 out of 15 completed. If I hover over that I, it's telling you that the return date is missing. So if you are coming back in a couple days later to enter the return to play date for an injury that occurred, when you log in, you'd come to this athlete tab, find the athlete over here on the left. If you click this little crutch underneath their name, it'll show you a list of their injuries that are in the system. And if I hit the pencil next to it to edit that injury, I can now enter a return date. And once I hit save, you'll see that that now says 15 out of 15, 100% complete, and that injury will now come through to our system since it's complete. There are a couple outcomes, as you may have seen, that don't require a return date, like if the athlete quits or they're out for the remainder of the season, that return to play date is not required, and this would be 14 out of 14. The next thing I'll show you is the treatment tab. So you can track treatments for your athletes. If you're just handing out a Band-Aid for a hangnail, you don't need to record that. Or if you're just handing out ice to someone who likes to ice every single day, you don't need to enter that. But if you have someone that's coming to you for treatment, we like for you to track that. So again, you'll find your athlete over here on the left. If I click on their name, again, you'll see that a list of their injuries in the system. And to add a treatment for this injury, I'll click this green plus sign. The start date would be that first date that you give them treatment. Complete date is not required, but if you wanted to enter a date that you're done giving them treatment for that injury, that's what you can enter there. Now under here is where you'll enter the actual date of the treatment that is given. So you select what you want from this drop down. Again, this notes section doesn't come through to us, but some people like to enter their parameters or any other notes, and that's what you can enter there. And then click that green plus sign, and you can keep adding however many treatments you'd like. Sometimes athletes come in multiple days in a row and get the same treatment. So if that's the case, instead of going through all those individual drop-downs, you can copy a day of treatments from one day to a different day. Click that green arrow, and it'll copy those over for you with that new date. Then you'll just hit save. One other thing I forgot to show you on the calendar is sometimes practices or games get canceled, maybe due to weather or for whatever reason. And to delete an activity, you'll just hover over it and click delete. And once you hit OK, it'll be removed. You'll notice one that I entered a participation count for cannot be deleted. And that's because if you've entered a participation count, the system assumes it already occurred, so you can't delete it. Same goes for if there's an injury linked to an exposure, it can't be deleted.